Hello and welcome to this video. This is part one of making sense of Beethoven's metronome speeds in the Hammerklavier piano sonata. This is part one of the series, and then part two of the series I will get into my theory and reasons behind Beethoven's metronome speeds. In this part one, I will go over several statistics analyzing performances by 20 legendary performers. Both of these parts one and part two, are going into my book in progress, Rhythm and Tempo for Pianists. This book will probably be out sometime in 2021. It's now August of 2020 as I make this video. So keep your eyes open for Rhythm and Tempo for Pianists. It will be around the magnitude of Sight Reading and Harmony, if you know this book. This was my flagship book for BachScholar Publishing. It's a really excellent seller. It's nice, it's thick, over 100 pages, spiral binding. Rhythm and Tempo Pianists, I plan, will be somewhat of this magnitude of Sight Reading and Harmony. So it will take me about probably a year to write it. That's why I'm projecting 2021 to be the finishing date for the book. In the book, one of the chapters in this book is called Making Sense of Historical Metronome Speeds. And so what I've done is I've sort of compiled much of what will later be in the book into these two parts of the video, parts one and parts two. And then also, pretty soon, when it's finished, I will have sort of a rough draft of the chapter along with parts of other chapters that are relevant to it, all mixed up into one big paper or one big article. I estimate it will probably be at least 30 pages long, maybe longer than that. And when this paper is finished, which actually will be much sooner than 2021, I will have a link for the paper below this part one and part two video, where you can download it for free on my website and read it at your convenience, since it's such an interesting topic and many pianists are interested in the topic of historical metronome speeds. So without any further ado, here is part one of making sense of Beethoven's metronome speeds in his Hammerklavier piano sonata. Hello and welcome to part one of this video. This is a portion of one of the chapters of my book in progress, Rhythm and Tempo for Pianists. And this particular section here in this video has to deal with Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata, Opus 106. It is the only piano piece in which Beethoven's original metronome speeds exist today. That's why it's very much talked about and debated in tempo circles. Just this work. He didn't give any metronome marks to other piano sonatas, only this one. Of the metronome marks given in other piano sonatas, they're given by other people, such as Czerny, who was a disciple or student of Beethoven. But this is really the only sonata, the Hammerklavier Sonata, Opus 106, in which Beethoven leaves us his actual original metronome speeds. The purpose of this section of this video is simply to lay out some statistics for you. I have my rough draft of my chapter from my book here, which will also be an article, which you will be able to look at pretty soon, as I'm finished with it. And I've compiled a whole bunch of statistics here based on performances of Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata. So let's just go over these statistics, these facts that I found in my research on the Hammerklavier Sonata. First of all, these are Beethoven's metronome marks here. The first movement is marked allegro. He marked half note equals 138. Second movement is marked assai vivace. The metronome mark that Beethoven gives is dotted half note equals 80. That equals quarter, or that translates to a quarter note equals 240. The third movement is in the Adagio sostenuto. It is in 6/8 time. Beethoven gives the metronome speed 92 per eighth note. And then the fourth section is divided up into two sections. The first section is marked largo. It's sort of like a recitative style. There's no, almost no regular bar lines in there. It changes a lot, so it's not really possible to really measure tempi here, although I did measure durations here for performers. Beethoven marks, though, 76 per 16th note, or semiquaver, for the largo section. That lasts a couple minutes. Then after that is the fugue, marked allegro risoluto, marked quarter note equals 144. Now, what I did here is I tallied up all the measures, all the bars or measures in all of these movements. I also had to account for, in the second movement, the scherzo here, assai vivace, there are a few measures in there that are 2/4 presto, that goes into 2/4 rather than 3/4, and then it goes back to 3/4. So I had to do some accounting for those measures. So basically what I did was I translated those into 3/4s and averaged them out, and therefore I could count the number of 3/4 measures in this movement here. Then I, counted the number of measures. I didn't really have to count. I used the Henley Urtext edition, who counts the measures for me. So basically what I did was I took the number of measures of each of these sections and multiplied that by the beat, or by the note that denotes the beat, like a half note here. So for example, the first movement with repeats consists of 528 measures. So I took 528 times 2, because there's 2 of these beats per measure, and then I would divide that by the performer's duration, with how long it took them to play. So if it took, let's say if it took 10.5 minutes, then it would be 528 times 2 divided by 10.5. Okay, I don't really have to go into the details of how I did it, but I did it in a very systematic and scientific fashion, and I determined all the tempi by 20 top-tier performers in all the movements of the Hammerklavier Sonata. So I did not get a metronome and listen to the first few bars and then put down what they played. I actually calculated the exact average duration from beginning to end of each performer's performance. And then what I did was I compiled that in tables. Okay, you'll see this when my book is finished eventually, or when the article is finished. So I put all these 20 performers' tempi for all the movements in these tables, and I came up with their durations and their exact average tempi per movement. And then I compiled a whole bunch of statistics about what I found. And this is very important because this leads to part 2. In part 2 of this video, I'm going to talk about how to make sense of Beethoven's metronome speeds, and some solutions. And I have some solutions and explanations as to why Beethoven gave these speeds. They're very controversial speeds, as you'll see in a couple minutes here. So anyway, I took these, I tallied them all up, and I found 20 top-tier legendary performers performing the Hammerklavier Sonata. These performers in alphabetical order are Claudio Arrau, Vladimir Ashkenazi, Wilhelm Backhaus, Paul Badura-Skoda, Daniel Barenboim, Alfred Grendel, Annie Fischer, Emil Galels, Glenn Gould, Friedrich Gould, Wilhelm Kempf, Igor Levit, Valentino Lisitsa, Marie Pariah, Maurizio Pollini, Sviatoslav Richter, Rudolf Serkin, Gregory Sokoloff, Solomon Kutner, also known as Solomon, and Yuzha Wang. There are probably many more of the performances of the Hammerklavier, but I chose these because these were readily available on YouTube and I could do my research there. You can go and listen to their performances here. Many of them, or some of them actually, have more than one recording. Maybe they'll have a live and they'll have a studio and whatever, but I chose usually just the one that was conveniently available for me. So you can go and check those out if you'd like. I also have some notes here at the top of some of these as to, and these are all listed in my table in my book and my article on the fastest and the slowest performances. And that's going to help us, make some sense out of these metronome speeds. If the Hammerklavier Sonata were to be played exactly at Beethoven's metronome speeds, average from beginning to end of each movement, it should last 32 minutes and 1 second. That's how exact I figured it out. 32 minutes and 1 second. We can just say 32 minutes. 32 minutes. Now, out of all 20 of these performers, the average duration for the whole sonata, all 4 movements, is 43 minutes, 24 seconds. Now, if you compare that to 32:01 or 32 minutes, that's a whole over 11 minutes slower than what Beethoven indicated. We're talking about maybe 1/4 to 1/3 slower. I can't do the math in my head right now, but it's significantly slower. Now, what I also did was one of my statistical charts here, I take Beethoven's metronome speeds and the resulting duration at that average speed for each movement. And then I found the slowest out of all these performers for each of the movements, then the average for each of these performers for the movement, and the fastest here. Now let's just go over these statistics. The slowest, the absolute slowest speed for the first movement, Mark Allegro, half note equals 138, was half note equals 74. You can probably guess who that is. Glenn Gould. Okay. Also, another thing I had to do was there were a few of them that didn't take repeats in the first movement. So if they omitted repeats in the first movement, what I did was I figured out their exact tempo of that, and then I based the duration on assuming if they had done repeats. Okay, so Glenn Gould's first movement lasts 14 minutes and 16 seconds, although his real performance is less than that because he didn't do repeats. But anyway, to make a long story short, he was the very slowest of all with half note equals 74. Guess who the next slowest was? The next slowest, I'm pretty sure, was, I'm pretty sure, Guess who the next slowest was? Gregory Sokoloff. Gregory Sokoloff over here. Great Russian pianist. Many people consider him to be one of the greatest living pianists right now, today in 2020. His performance of the whole entire sonata was pretty much the same as Glenn Gould's. Gould and Sokoloff were only just 7 seconds off in the whole sonata. But Gould and Sokoloff get the prize for being the absolute slowest of anyone. Gould and Sokoloff, they didn't care at all about what Beethoven wrote. And you know what's ironic about it is, in my personal opinion, I think Sokoloff's is one of the finest performances out of all 20. I don't think Gould's is. Personally, I'm not crazy about Gould's performance. It's a little clinical and dry. Sokoloff, on the other hand, from a personal perspective, I think it was just fabulous performance, a live performance, I believe. Another one of the slower ones was Emile Gallel's, very well known for his slow tempi. Emile Gallel's was just about 3 or so minutes off from Gould and Sokoloff. Emile Gallel's plays, I believe, like 78 or something for, let me see, what does he play for the first movement? Emile Gallel's, 87. Okay, so he was a little faster than Sokoloff. Played half note equals 78, Gould played 74, and Gallel's plays 87. Still a far cry from Beethoven's 138. And also another instance of one of the finest performances, I think, is Emile Gallel's. Emile Gallel's, and this is just subjective opinion here, this doesn't have to do with science or anything. Emile Gallel's and Gregory Sokoloff are two of the very slowest performances of the whole sonata. And in my opinion, those are two of the absolute finest recordings. So this just shows right away that speed does not necessarily make a great performance. And it causes a bigger rift now between what we consider good art and what we consider crazy metronome speeds over here, which I'll get to in part 2. So anyway, going on, the average speed for the first movement was, out of 20 performers, the average speed was half note equals 95 beats per minute per half note. The fastest was 107. Okay, 107 per half note was the fastest, and that was done by Friedrich, well, it's a very close call between Friedrich Gould. Friedrich Gould played 106 per half note in the first movement. Murray Pryor plays 106. And it's got to be a 107 here. Oh yeah, but Paul Badura-Skoda. Paul Badura-Skoda plays it the fastest of all. Half note equals 107. Okay, so the absolute fastest recording I could find of these 20 performers is 107 beats per minute per half note, average from beginning to end. 107, 138. So this tells us something. If the fastest performance by anyone out of these 20 legendary performers is only 107 beats per minute per half note, and Beethoven marks 138, it tells us something. First of all, it tells us it's humanly impossible to play Beethoven's tempo. Because if it were possible, somebody would have done it. because you can tell a lot of these performers tried to play really fast. You think, wow, that sounds really, really fast. But they don't even come close. 107 is far away from 138. So they try and try and try, but they can't do it. Nobody was able to play 138. It's humanly impossible. Now, another humanly impossible speed is the second movement, the scherzo marked dotted half note equals 80, which translates to quarter note equals 240. 240, that's a really fast speed. The absolute slowest out of all the scherzi of these 20 performers was 142 beats per minute per quarter note, which resulted in a duration of 3 minutes and 25 seconds. That was done, by the way, by who was that done by? Oh, Sokoloff. Gregory Sokoloff. Okay, so Gregory Sokoloff gets the prize for the slowest scherzo. Maybe he just wasn't good enough. He's just not good enough to do Bach or Beethoven's 240, so he has to slow it down. I'm being facetious here. Of course, he's good enough. If he wanted to, he probably could, but maybe he can't, because perhaps that is impossible. We'll see. The average speed of the scherzo, the second movement, was quarter note equals 188. Okay, that translates to dotted half note equals about 63. Rounded off, I believe, about 63. That's the average. The very fastest that any of these 20 performers did for the second movement, the scherzo, was quarter note is 214. 214. 214 is a far cry from 240. It's a full 26 beats per minute too slow. Here's another instance. Oh, by the way, you probably want to know who that was, who played the scherzo the fastest. And that person was Friedrich Gould. Friedrich Gould. One of my least favorite performances of all of the Hammerklavier. In fact, Friedrich Gould was the absolute fastest out of all 20, when you add up all the movements, at 37 minutes and 37 seconds. But Friedrich Gould's performance, a live performance, that's the fastest out of all 20 at 37 minutes, a little over 37 minutes. But it's still a far cry from Beethoven's 32 minutes. So it's over 5 minutes too slow. So, good try, Mr. Gould, but you weren't able to do it. In fact, no one is able to do it. It's humanly impossible. You won't find a performer that plays the Hammerklavier with repeats in the first movement that lasts 32 minutes. It's not going to happen. If these 20 performers couldn't do it, then no one else will be able to do it. So we have the slowest, average, and fastest for the scherzo. So these two movements, the first and second movements, I want to emphasize this. There was not one performer out of 20 that was able to play Beethoven's metronome speeds in either of these movements. Not one. They were all far from it. They were far under Beethoven's prescribed metronome speeds. That tells me that it is humanly impossible. So Beethoven's 138 per half, humanly impossible. Beethoven's dotted half note equals 80 or quarter note equals 240, humanly impossible. If it were possible, someone would have done it. They try. You can hear, there's a lot of these performers, when you hear their scherzo, you think, oh gosh, they're going so fast. Oh, they're playing Beethoven's metronome speed. No, they aren't, because when you tally it up, they're a far cry from that. 240 is really, really fast. There wasn't anybody able to do that. So we have to ask ourselves, is that really, even if it were humanly possible, would it be the right musical thing to do just because Beethoven marked that speed? We'll get into that in more detail in part 2. Now let's move on to the third movement. Here, the very beautiful Adagio sostenuto in 6/8. Beethoven marked it 92 per 8th note. Now, if played at Beethoven's exact metronome speed from beginning to end, it should last 12 minutes and 12 seconds. 12 minutes and 12 seconds. Now, the average duration for the third movement, the Adagio, out of these 20 performers was 18 minutes and 6 seconds. So it's a full 6 minutes slower than what Beethoven indicated. I don't think that's humanly impossible necessarily. I think it's an Adagio. I think if somebody wanted to, they could easily play it at 92 beats per minute. But it's not desirable. It's just not desirable. Otherwise, one of these great 20 performers would have done it. So anyway, the very slowest, the absolute slowest tempo in the Adagio was 51 beats per minute per 8th note, 51, which results in a duration of 22 minutes and 10 seconds. That, by the way, was done by Solomon Kutner, the great British pianist. But it's really ironic here because what Solomon does, Solomon has the absolute slowest performance of the Adagio. It's almost half speed. Okay, Beethoven marks 92, he plays 51. Half speed is like 46, so he's only 5 beats per minute faster than half speed. So he's almost half speed. But at the same time, Solomon clocked one of the absolute fastest performances of the first movement at 105 beats per minute. So he has the greatest extremes out of all the performers. The fastest first movement, the slowest third movement. It doesn't make any sense when you're if you care about Beethoven's metronome speeds. Why try so hard to follow Beethoven's metronome mark in the first movement, but then totally disregard it in the third movement, or vice versa? It just doesn't make any sense. We'll get into that in part 2. Anyway, the fastest, the absolute fastest speed for the Adagio, the third movement, is 72 beats per minute per 8th note. That results in a duration of 15 minutes and 20 seconds. And that was done once again by Friedrich Gould. Friedrich Gould did that. It's not a particularly enjoyable performance, in my opinion. It's just fast. It's probably Gould is probably my least favorite of all 20 when I listen to them. Now, bear in mind, I didn't listen to every single note of every one. I usually listen to some, a few minutes of it, and I would clock it and find out the duration and so forth. So I didn't actually listen to 100% of everyone's performance. But of what I heard, it's probably my least favorite musically. My most favorite probably was Gilels and Sokoloff. Gilels and Sokoloff probably tied, in my opinion, at I think the best performances. Glenn Gould and Friedrich Gould, just in my opinion, are 2 of the poorest out of all 20. That's just my opinion. Anyway, going back to this, the third movement, the average tempo in the third movement is 62 beats per minute per 8th note, 62. So the average duration is 18 minutes and 6 seconds. And I mentioned that previously. It's a full, like 6 minutes slower than what Beethoven indicated here. So this shows us a trend that when I was analyzing these tempi and listening to their performances, it seems that most performers, with a few exceptions, like maybe Gilels and Sokoloff and Gould, with few exceptions, most performers tend to play the first and second movements as fast as they can, right, really fast, presumably because they might be influenced by Beethoven's metronome speeds. So most performers tended to play as fast as they can in first and second movements, but then in the third movement they don't care. They do whatever they want. So they don't try to follow Beethoven's metronome speeds, they just play what they think is natural. So there's a sort of a disconnect here because there's not a consistency in reasoning. And like I said before, if you're going to disregard Beethoven's metronome speeds in one movement, the third movement, well, then why should you try so hard to play 138 in the first movement or 240 in the second movement? Well, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, you need to stay consistent with your reasoning and logic. Now, let's move on to the fourth movement. The first section here of the fourth movement is a short, sort of recitative section that lasts probably an average of around 2 minutes. The average out of 20 performers was 2 minutes and 9 seconds for that. There's no real way to clock the tempo there, so I don't care about the tempo necessarily in that section. Now the fugue, though, is really important. That's what I'll talk about now. The fugue section consists of 390 measures of 3/4, and it's marked Allegro risoluto, quarter note equals 144. That's a really fast speed. That is a really fast speed for just an Allegro. In fact, 144 is more like a presto or prestissimo, because out of all 20 performers, only 2 of them were able to attain Beethoven's 144. Only 2. And the others are pretty far off. The two, actually the very, let me go over the slope. The very slowest of the fugue is quarter note equals 111 by none other than Glenn Gould. 10 minutes and 30 seconds here. The average duration of the fugue was 9 minutes and 26 seconds, which means that quarter note is 124. So the average tempo of all 20 performers in the fugue was 124 beats per minute, compared to I keep saying Bach, compared to Beethoven's 144. So it's 20 beats per minute slower than Beethoven's 144. The fastest is 8 minutes, and that was a quarter note speed of 146, and guess who did that? Vladimir Ashkenazy, and his very nice performance. So Ashkenazy was able to do, in fact, exceed. He averaged 146 per quarter note, which is just above 144. There's one other performer that did that played it actually just about the same as Ashkenazy. In fact, Friedrich Gould clocked in at 8 minutes and 2 seconds. So he was just 2 seconds behind Ashkenazy. So Ashkenazy and Gould get the prize for the fastest fugue. Both of them were at 146. Now, here's the question. Why didn't anybody else do it? Why are we not hearing other performers doing 144? I mean, is it, well, it's possible, it's humanly possible because 2 performers did it, but clearly, out of all these great performers, clearly they don't want to, or they try to, they think they're doing it. They try to play as fast as they can, but they just don't succeed. They just don't reach that goal. The average is 124, which is 20 beats per minute slower than what Beethoven wrote. So once again, here's some flawed reasoning that many performers follow. From my experience listening to these 20 legendary performers, my conclusion is that most performers try so hard to play the first, second, and movements in the fugue as fast as they can in order to, presumably, to meet Beethoven's metronome speeds. But none of them succeed. They play as fast as they can, but they just don't succeed in doing it. The only two performers out of all 20, there's only 2 instances out of all 20, out of all movements, in which Beethoven's metronome speeds were actually done, and that's in the fugue by Ashkenazi and Gould. Other than that, they're all off, and they're all way far off from Beethoven's metronome speeds. Gosh, this creates a problem. We have to make sense of this. We have to make sense of this. The title of my article and my chapter in my book is Making Sense of Historical Metronome Speeds. We need to make sense of this. We need to figure out what this all means. What does it mean that no performers can play Beethoven's metronome speeds, or if they try really hard, they just can't do it? What does it mean that they clearly ignore Beethoven's metronome speed in a movement they could do it in, like the Adagio, but they don't? And in these 3 movements, 1, 2, and the fugue, are played as fast as possible, or really fast, as fast as they can, in order to meet Beethoven's specifications. It doesn't make any sense. So if you stay tuned for the second part of this video, Making Sense of Historical Metronome Speeds, I'm going to offer you my theory and my thoughts about why Beethoven wrote these metronome speeds, the reason behind it. I'm going to tell you whether I think his metronome was broken. That's a popular theory that's been going around. I'm going to tell you what I think about the double beat or whole beat metronome practice theory, because this says a lot. It tells us a lot to analyze 20 legendary performers and see what they do, average it all out, look at the statistics. This tells us something. This tells us something. We just have to interpret this in the right fashion. So stay tuned for the second part of this video, in which I will offer you my thoughts and my theory about what Beethoven really meant when he wrote these metronome speeds.